Tonight at 10, the scale of the Omicron crisis is revealed as new figures suggest 1 in every 15 people in the UK was infected in the run-up to New Year's Eve. No more PCR tests to confirm a positive lateral flow result in England and Wales to help ease pressure on labs if there are no symptoms, but fears remain for hospitals.
Potentially of greatest concern, case rates are now rising rapidly among the older and more vulnerable, including doubling every week among those over 60, with the obvious risk that this will continue to increase the pressures on our NHS.
However, the Prime Minister insists the current level of COVID restrictions in England is helping take the edge off the Omicron wave. Also tonight, Novak Djokovic has his visa revoked to play in the Australian Open. It follows controversy over an exemption to COVID vaccine rules. A state of emergency is declared in Kazakhstan following mass protests sparked by surging fuel prices.
It's a victory for anyone who wants to be on the right side of history.
And 4 are cleared in Bristol of criminal damage after the toppling of a statue during a Black Lives Matter protest.
And coming up in the sport on the BBC News channel, Wales could play their home Six Nations rugby matches in England, away from their Cardiff base because of COVID restrictions.
Good evening. Boris Johnson insists the current level of COVID restrictions in England is helping take the edge off the Omicron wave and that the government is taking a balanced approach to the pandemic. But new figures highlight the scale of the challenge. The latest survey from the Office for National Statistics shows that 1 in every 15 people across the UK had COVID in the run-up to New Year's Eve. That's the highest level of infections recorded by the ONS since the pandemic began. Now, rules on testing are to change to try to help cope with demand. Anyone who has a positive lateral flow test but no symptoms won't have to confirm the result with a PCR test. Number 10 says it's not sensible to use PCR capacity when prevalence of COVID is extremely high. With more details, here's our Deputy Political Editor, Vicky Young.
A new year, a familiar problem.
Are you gambling with the NHS, Prime Minister?
England has fewer restrictions than many other countries. Boris Johnson says his plan B, which is more masks, COVID passports and working from home, will stay in place, but that's it for now. In the Commons, he was bullish about the strategy.
Because of the balanced and the proportionate approach that we've taken to COVID. We've been able to keep this country open, keep our economy moving, more open than any other comparable economy in Europe. And they know it, Mr. Speaker.
With a huge rise in cases, the testing system has been under strain. So today, a change in England and Wales. If you don't have COVID symptoms and your lateral flow test is positive, you'll still have to isolate, but won't have to confirm the result with a PCR. Staff shortages, though, remain a major problem. In hospitals and other sectors, services are being cancelled or delayed because so many are in isolation. The Labour leader is one of them after testing positive for the second time. His deputy stood in.
Doctors, nurses, carers, teachers and pupils can't get the tests they need now to do 2 tests a week. Emergency workers are reportedly stuck in isolation because they can't get their hands on a test. The government has been asleep at the wheel, Mr. Speaker, and the result is total shambles.
Before Christmas, the Prime Minister was under huge pressure after his own MPs defied him and he had to rely on Labour votes to get his COVID plans through. Boris Johnson is the kind of politician who instinctively prefers to let people make their own decisions. But even if he wanted to introduce tighter restrictions, that would mean another damaging fight with his own MPs. So for now, he's leaving things as they are, while admitting that parts of the NHS might feel overwhelmed.
Theresa May
Today, Tory MPs were more supportive, but are now pushing for an exit plan.
It is not in the national interest to partially or wholly shut down sectors of our economy every time we see a new variant. So will my right honourable friend take this opportunity to inform the House as to whether and how the government will be changing its approach when new variants arrive?
We have got to have a plan to live with this virus like normal forever. When is he going to set that plan out?
For now, though, Mr Johnson is watching and waiting to see the full effects of this latest COVID wave. Vicky Young, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, the latest figures do suggest a steep rise in infections across the UK. In the northwest of England, infection rates have doubled in a week and are running at one person in every 15 contracting COVID. That's about 8% of the population. Our correspondent Dominic Hughes has been finding out how local health authorities are coping.
Across the northwest of England, the Omicron variant is building.
We've got the CT on here.
Infections are spreading. And while it might be a relatively milder form of the virus, the numbers involved mean hospitals are feeling the pressure.
The rise in cases of Omicron is absolutely enormous. It's rising very, very rapidly indeed. I think what will probably happen is it will keep rising, but it will peak fairly soon, and our hope is that this lasts for more weeks rather than months.
The most recent data shows how fast Omicron has spread in the northwest of England. Just before Christmas, an estimated 3.2% of the population in the region had coronavirus, around 1 in 30 people. By New Year's Eve, that number had more than doubled to 7.8%, 1 in 15.
January is always a really tough month for the health service, but as well as the usual winter pressures, there are now a growing number of COVID patients arriving at hospitals, as well as staff themselves falling sick or having to isolate because of the virus. And that's why the Royal Bolton is one of 17 hospitals across Greater Manchester where non-urgent surgery has been suspended.
Staff absences aren't just affecting hospitals, but community nursing teams and care homes too.
Okay, you take care.
Yesterday, the Prime Minister talked of riding out this wave, but local leaders warn there will be some tough weeks ahead.
We believe we need to be more vigilant than that and, recognise that this month will present real challenges. That was the message we were getting from our experts this morning. It's going to be a very difficult month.
And as the virus spreads from its London epicentre, what's happening now in the northwest could well be seen right across the country.
Well, there are huge pressures across the health and care system wherever you look. And despite incredible and extraordinary effort at the front line, we have got patients who are waiting too long to have their 999 call answered. And also we've got people who are waiting too long to be seen in accident and emergency departments. We also know there's pressures in terms of people being able to access mental health services and community services.
With more sick patients and a growing number of absent staff, some hospitals are now approaching the limits of what counts as safe care. And that means taking some tough decisions on what they can and can't do. Dominic Hughes, BBC News, Manchester.
The government's latest coronavirus figures show there were just under 195,000 new coronavirus infections recorded in the latest 24-hour period. On average, there were over 183,000 new cases reported per day in the last week. There were 17,276 people in hospital being treated with coronavirus as of yesterday. 334 deaths were reported in the latest 24-hour period. That's of people who died within 28 days of a positive COVID test. But that figure does include a backlog of hospital deaths reported overnight by NHS England, covering the period from the 1st to the 4th of January. On average, in the past week, 171 deaths were announced every day. On vaccinations, more than 34.5 million people have had a booster jab, which means more than 60% of people aged 12 and over have now had 3 vaccine doses. Scotland is to cut the coronavirus isolation period from 10 days to 7, in line with the rest of the UK. From midnight, anyone who tests positive will be allowed to leave their homes if they record a negative lateral flow test on days 6 and 7. Restrictions on social distancing, large gatherings and hospitality are, however, expected to remain in force until January the 17th at the earliest. Here's Alexandra Mackenzie.
Another new term overshadowed by coronavirus as some children in Scotland returned to the classroom.
I thought they would put another lockdown on school. I did think that, and I was hoping that was going to happen.
I actually feel okay about it, because we've had coronavirus a few months ago.
Up to a quarter of the staff were off at the Glasgow Gaelic School because of COVID.
It is going to cause some challenges. We are going to have to think about reorganising classes and having teachers cover for their absent colleagues.
At a virtual session of the Scottish Parliament, the First Minister said isolation rules would be relaxed from 10 days to 7 for those with COVID, dependent on negative tests. And household contacts can take lateral flow tests from midnight to night instead of isolating.
These changes are significant and they are not completely without risk. However, at this stage of the pandemic, they do strike an appropriate balance.
This comes after weeks of pressure from opposition parties. The First Minister previously said it would spread infection even further.
I also welcome the changes to self-isolation, which the Scottish Conservatives have been calling for since day one. When they were introduced, we said this policy was not sustainable. Every other part of the United Kingdom made the change, but Scotland was left as an outlier.
Hospitality has struggled with so many staff isolating. The announcement came as a welcome relief to many.
Common sense has prevailed, that has been reduced. The 10 days on its own was unsustainable. The last few weeks it's felt like you're almost being punished.
The Scottish Government said at least 1 in 20 of us now has coronavirus. The number of new cases recorded yesterday was more than 16,000. And in the last week, the number of people in hospital has almost doubled. As businesses prepare for the new rules, the First Minister warned this phase of the pandemic is possibly the most challenging so far. Alexandra Mackenzie, BBC News, Glasgow.
The travel industry has welcomed the relaxation of the rules for people arriving in England and Wales from overseas. Those who are fully vaccinated will no longer have to take pre-departure tests from the early hours of Friday morning. And those arriving from Sunday morning will be able to take a lateral flow test rather than a PCR. Well, our transport correspondent Katie Austin is at St Pancras International Station in London for us tonight. Katie, good news for travellers and the hard-pressed travel industry.
Yes, Clive, this marks a return to pre-Omicron arrangements. So from this weekend, international travel is about to get cheaper and easier again for fully vaccinated passengers. No pre-departure tests and a lateral flow test upon arrival into England, although if that's positive, a PCR test will be necessary. The UK government says that with Omicron now the dominant variant, it is proportionate to cautiously reduce testing measures at the borders. This has been welcomed by the travel industry, which has said the current measures were really hitting demand at a crucial time. So there's more optimism now from businesses, although the past couple of months have shown us just how quickly things can still change. And there are plenty of other countries who still have pretty strict entry requirements in place. Scotland hasn't yet confirmed whether it will be following England's lead with these changes. Wales has confirmed that it will, although the Welsh Health Minister said he was doing that reluctantly and he was concerned about how quickly the UK government was reopening international travel.
Katie, thank you for that. Katie Austin there at St Pancras in North London. Across Europe, governments are struggling to contain the Omicron variant, leading to record number of cases in some countries. The government of Italy, which reported a record 189,000 COVID infections today, is making vaccines mandatory for the over 50s. And in France, where 335,000 cases were reported, President Macron used controversial language to say he wants to make life more difficult for people who haven't been vaccinated. Mark Lowen reports now from Rome.
The youngest to be armed in the endless battle against COVID. 5-year-old Eduardo gets his first jab as Italy steps up vaccinations for children. Maybe too small to grasp how the pandemic has changed their world. But, say parents, they too must fight it.
Why did you want to vaccinate your son?
Because I love him. Because his father and I really love him and want him and all his little friends to go back to a normal life. So this is the least we can do. Respect science and respect our children.
Come è andata?
It was okay, says Eduardo.
Non ti sei fatta male?
Did it hurt? I asked. Just a little bit.
Pochino.
They do their best here to soften the experience with certificates of bravery, a rite of passage for the pandemic generation.
You can see the smile on their face when they ask to you, now I can see my friend, you can say yes, you can play with them and everything, because now the vaccine for COVID-19 is so important for everything.
When Italy became the first country in the West to fall to the virus in 2020, it was the first in the world to impose a nationwide lockdown. But today, despite record cases, its streets are once again busy, as it, like much of Europe, tightens vaccine rules instead, to some resistance.
C'est inadmissible!
In France, a heated debate in Parliament over mandatory vaccination for restaurants and trains was suspended amid opposition protests over an interview with President Macron. He told a newspaper he aimed to bar the unvaccinated from social activities, using the slang word emmerder, or to piss them off. On the streets of Paris, mixed views on the colourful language.
To piss people off, I think that's a bit out of place for a president to say.
The message is that he wants to improve things, but his form of words wasn't great.
At the vaccine centre, they're ramping up shots before schools resume next week, hoping to stem the Omicron surge. Among the messages, my biggest dream is that COVID ends. Sometimes children just put it best. Mark Lowen, BBC News, Rome.
Well, as we've been hearing, more than 3.7 million people in the UK would have tested positive for coronavirus in the week ending the 31st of December. That's according to figures from the Office for National Statistics. Now, the infection rate increased in all the home nations. In England, it was 1 in 15. In Wales, 1 in 20, with the same rate in Scotland. And in Northern Ireland, it was 1 in 25. All the figures are the highest recorded by the ONS since its survey began. Let's get more analysis on all of this from our health editor, Hugh Pym, who's here. Hugh, those figures are a sobering reminder of just how infectious Omicron's been.
Yes, Clive, a startling figure, that 3.7 million people in the UK with the virus at the end of last week. It was 2.3 million just a week before. And the significance of this ONS survey is it covers households and picks up people who haven't come forward for tests because they don't know they've got the virus, they haven't got symptoms. We've seen a bit of a slowing in the rate of growth in London, the epicentre, but a marked acceleration in areas of the north of England and Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, showing just how extensively Omicron is now spreading. With hospital admissions, they are only just over half what they were in January last year during the surge then. That's largely because of the success of the vaccine programme, and Omicron is less serious. But admissions are still going up week on week by 60%, so they'll still be watched very closely by policy makers. We've had this deaths figure, very high relatively, of 334 for a single day, but it does follow 2 days of underreporting in England because of delays with the data. We are getting quite close, though, to a total of 150,000 deaths during this pandemic.
Sure. OK, Hugh, thank you. Hugh Pym. Now, the row over whether the world #1 men's tennis player Novak Djokovic will be able to play in the Australian Open has deepened tonight after his visa was revoked to enter the country. Now, the player, who had been forced to remain at Melbourne Airport for several hours, is reportedly filing an injunction to prevent his deportation. Djokovic was given a medical pass for the Grand Slam tournament, prompting criticism that he was getting special treatment. Our sports correspondent, Natalie Perks, has the very latest.
It's the story that's gripped Australia.
Access denied. An extraordinary visa bungle sees Novak Djokovic detained for hours under armed guard at Melbourne Airport.
But this was no mere bungle. In the last hour, the defending champion has been told his visa has been revoked and he will be deported.
Failed to provide appropriate evidence to meet the entry requirements to Australia, and visa has been subsequently cancelled.
His team had been patiently waiting for answers. His coach, former Wimbledon champion Goran Ivanisevic, posted this picture saying, "Not the most usual trip down under." You can say that again. Last time Djokovic won the tournament, this time he was facing a public less than enamoured with the idea of watching him play in their country.
You shouldn't be allowed to come. It's his choice not to be vaccinated, which is fine, and I think the government here has made the choice that, you should be vaccinated.
I guess he might even get booed when he gets up onto the court.
We have someone that's come from overseas and all of a sudden he's been exempt and can play, and I think it's an absolute disgrace and I won't be watching it.
Officials had denied prioritising Djokovic, who's on record as being against the COVID vaccine. They said only a handful of exemptions were granted following a robust review involving independent medical panels. A recent COVID infection was the most common reason. But the Djokovic incident soon became a diplomatic one. Earlier, the Serbian president said the country was doing everything to see that the harassment of Novak Djokovic is brought to an end immediately. But while the player was flying earlier, the Australian leader was clear Tennis Australia might have found him to be exempt, but he still had to prove his case at the border.
We await his presentation and what evidence he provides to support that. If that evidence is insufficient, then he won't be treated any different to anyone else and he'll be on the next plane home. So there should be no special rules for Novak Djokovic at all, none whatsoever.
Another win in Melbourne would have moved Djokovic clear of Rafa Nadal and Roger Federer with a record 21 Grand Slams. But instead of gearing up for a shot at history, he's working on an injunction to prevent his deportation tonight. Natalie Perks, BBC News.
The Business Secretary Kwasi Kwarteng has been chairing a virtual meeting with representatives of the energy industry to consider ways of tackling what providers are calling a national crisis. The cost at which they have to buy gas on the wholesale markets has shot up, threatening more bankruptcies among providers. Well, our business editor Simon Jack is here. Simon, what, if anything, can the government do, and is the knock-on effect that price rises for us, and is that inevitable?
Price rises are inevitable. We know enough about what's happened to wholesale prices that we know the retail gas price cap, energy price cap, is going to go up in April, probably by about 50%. The government knows it's got to do something to mitigate that, and they looked at some of the options today. Abolish the 5% VAT on energy bills, say the Labour Party today. They renewed their calls. Too blunt, say the government. It means other households better off would also benefit. What about taking the green levies, a substantial part of our bill, and deferring those? Tricky when we've just had a climate summit and those levies are designed to wean us off fossil fuels like gas. What about merging them into general taxation? Chancellor doesn't want to add to the tax burden because at the same time the new price cap comes in, national insurance increases also come at the same time. So what does that leave? It leaves targeted support, something like the Warm Homes discount. You can get £140 if you apply, if you receive certain benefits. You could increase that amount or expand the eligibility of that. Others in the energy industry say these price rises are so big and so wide that narrow targeting won't work. They're going to have to figure out what to do before February the 7th, when that is when they're going to set the new price cap, which will come into effect in April. At that point, that's when the cost of living squeeze we're seeing will really intensify.
Sure. OK, Simon, thank you. Simon Jack, business editor there. A state of emergency has been declared in Kazakhstan, where protests sparked by surging fuel prices have broadened into unrest over corruption and authoritarian rule. In the country's largest city of Almaty, demonstrators seized the airport and stormed government buildings. The Kazakh president Kassym-Jomart Tokayev, who has sacked his government, says there'll be a tough response to the protests. Our diplomatic correspondent Paul Adams has the latest.
Across this vast country, scenes of tension and turmoil. In Almaty, running battles lasted on into the night. The police struggling to maintain control in this Kazakhstan's biggest city. This is the fourth day of protests, what began as demonstrations over energy prices, now morphing into something more serious. They said Kazakhs wouldn't take to the streets, says Rafiq, but we've grown tired and we've had enough. Earlier, protesters stormed City Hall, security forces responding with tear gas and stun grenades. President Tokayev said terrorist gangs were trying to take over parts of the country. In an address to the nation, he threatened tough action and declared a state of emergency. He's called on neighbours, including Russia, for help. Far to the west, in the port city of Aktau, more crowds on the streets where it all began at the weekend. A sudden jump in the price of liquefied natural gas used to power cars caused fury. But the protests have now tapped into other long-standing grievances, corruption and economic hardship. Some vent their anger on the country's former leader, Nursultan Nazarbayev, who remains powerful. Old man leave, they chant. In another city, a crowd tries to pull his statue down. The US has urged the authorities to show restraint, but back in Almaty, some policemen were simply giving up. The government says 8 officers and National Guardsmen have been killed. Chaos is spreading. Paul Adams, BBC News.
4 people have been cleared of criminal damage over the toppling of the statue of a slave trader during a Black Lives Matter protest in Bristol in 2020. Rhiann Graham, Milo Ponsford, Sage Willoughby and Jake Scoos were charged after the monument to Edward Colston was pulled down and thrown in the River Avon. This report from Andrew Plant contains some flashing images from the very beginning.
Emerging from court after weeks on trial. Nicknamed the Colston 4, now found not guilty of criminal damage.
We just want to say thank you to so many people, because we have never been alone in this journey. So many people reverberating across the world in response to it. And one thing that we know now is that Colston does not represent Bristol.
It was June the 7th, 2020, during a Black Lives Matter protest. The statue of slave trader Edward Colston tied up and toppled. The 125-year-old bronze sprayed with graffiti and rolled into the water of the harbour nearby.
This has been a case like no other in terms of that complete polarisation of public opinion.
Edward Colston made his fortune in the transatlantic slave trade. Across the city, buildings, pubs, streets and schools carried his name. The protest made headlines worldwide. Many venues began dropping the Colston name. Conversations began about statues and monuments elsewhere.
It's not about the statue, it's really about the story that we tell of ourselves, the heroes that we lionise and those that we now wish to perhaps move away from.
The defence said the toppling of the statue was justified because of Edward Colston's past.
The defendants never disputed their actions. They accepted what they had done, but they said that they had a lawful excuse for their actions. And that goes again to the offensive nature of the statue.
18 months on, the plinth where the statue stood is still empty. The Colston 4 always wanted to defend themselves in court, convinced they'd done nothing wrong that day, and today the jury here agreed with them.
For the Colston 4!
Andrew Plant, BBC News in Bristol.
Play in the 4th Ashes Test in Sydney is about to start for the second day, with both sides evenly poised after England's bowlers made some initial headway. Stuart Broad, on his recall, took the wicket of David Warner, leaving Australia at the close of day 1 on 126 for 3. England trail in the 5-test series 3-0. That's it. Now on BBC One, time for the news where you are. Have a very good night.